Not too long ago, we were both booksellers. And when somebody walks into a bookshop and asks a staff member for a recommendation, they usually don't ask straightforward questions like, I want a fantasy recommendation, or I want a dystopia recommendation, or I want a fiction recommendation. They usually have different types of questions that are a little bit more difficult to answer, but are also more interesting to answer than just pointing into a certain section of the bookshop. Questions like, I want a book with a really great main character that is in first person. Or, I want a book with a great romantic subplot but not a romance book. Or, I want a period piece that isn't about war or tragedies. So this gave us the idea of this series of videos where we recommend books based on different prompts that have nothing to do with genre, and we're trying to be as diverse genre-wise as we can with these recommendations that all have the same thing in common. And for this particular video, we are going to give you some recommendations of books that have great dialogue.
One of my favourite things.
I don't tend to notice dialogue as much as you do. I notice it when the dialogue is bad, and I notice it more in certain genres than in others, where I think dialogue is more important. But I think it's important every time. And these are just some books where we think the dialogue is especially good. Welcome back to StoryToob.
For me, dialogue is probably the most important thing, an indicator that I look for in good writing. What is good writing in my opinion anyway? I need dialogue to be authentic to the characters in that book. That doesn't mean that authentic in terms of, modern day dialogue in what... I mean authentic for the book being written, authentic for the place it's set in, authentic for the time it's in, and authentic to the relationships between the characters in the book. Too often, I come across books where characters are simply explaining what is happening in the book to each other as if the other character didn't already know, or saying, do you remember on page 67 when we both robbed that bank? Well, that bank that we robbed on page 66, nobody talks like that. And so many books are filled with that because authors try to get plot out in dialogue and it feels unnatural. Anyway, me having a bit of a background in screenwriting and like studying it and writing it, obviously that's dialogue heavy, so you really have to practice and nail down your dialogue in that, but it just means that I kind of have an eye for it now.
That has happened to me too, to be fair. Like, ever since getting into screenwriting, it has made me more conscious of dialogue, specifically when writing myself.
Yeah.
Even if it's not screenwriting, like scripts that I'm writing.
It doesn't, like, I don't want it to sound arrogant as well, like, oh, I am the dialogue master. Not really, it has given me an eye for it. Like, it makes me more aware of it.
It trains you on it because it's the only thing you have. Well, not the only thing, but like to convey specifics of like the world building and the plot when you're writing a script.
Yeah, conveying story, getting a story to move along while keeping dialogue feeling natural is a very difficult thing to do. A lot of writers struggle with it. However, a lot of writers are extremely good at it. And we're gonna give you a list of writers and books that are exceptional at dialogue. Included in this list are some of my favorite authors, just because I think some of my favorite authors are some of the best, in my opinion, at writing dialogue. Anyway, if you have followed this channel for any length of time, some of these authors I've mentioned many times before, but we'll just get the predictable ones out of the way first. And the first one I'll mention is my beloved Tana French. This is The Trespasser, which I think is my favourite Tana French book because there's a personal connection to it as well. It's set in North Inner City Dublin, all the places I grew up, the place we live. The dialogue in this book is very real to the people that I know, that I've grown up around, that the person that I am. The way I speak here on BookTube and the way I maybe speak in my professional life is perhaps softened, watered down a bit. My accent is a lot softer than it used to be. It's a lot softer than when I just get together with my mates. But there's a dialect, there's a way of speaking in North Dublin that is very distinct and rich and full of character. And Tana French absolutely nails it. She has obviously this series of books called the Dublin Murder Squad that follows detectives in the squad. And each book follows a different set of detectives. And what makes this one so special is that it's just so intrinsically inner city Dublin, and specifically my part of Dublin. So I love this one because of the way the characters interact and talk to each other. And obviously, you know, there's also a great plot in this book. There's great, you know, character journeys. But the dialogue in particular is really a standout here. And another standout is the interrogation scenes. Some of the interrogation scenes in this book, you know, there's a murder that happens and our two lead detectives that are the main characters in this book are investigating. And there's a lot of interrogation scenes, and those scenes are magic, utterly gripping. But ultimately, one thing that really stands out is the way Tana French writes dialogue. There's another author on this list that kind of fits the same mold for, you know, giving a voice to the Dublin that I know and the Dublin that I grew up in and the way I speak. But we'll get to that author in a second. This is Tana French, The Trespasser. Crime fiction, heavily character focused, great dialogue, wonderful sense of place, a brilliant book, brilliant author. And she can change up her style depending on where she sets her books. We mentioned in a previous video in this series, The Searcher, which is set in the west of Ireland, and her rhythm, the rhythm to her writing and the rhythm to her dialogue is a little different there. It's a little calmer. Whereas the Dublin books are a little more rough and ready. I just appreciate that. It's a way to be artistic and kind of stylish while also being a little rough around the edges, which I appreciate.
Well, if you're going to gush about one of your favourite authors, then so will I. The book I wanted to talk about is City on Fire by Don Winslow. Shocking. So I think Don Winslow is good at dialogue in general. There's not a single one of his books that I would say doesn't have great dialogue, but the reason I picked this one in particular is that this trilogy, it's the Danny Ryan trilogy, City on Fire, City of Dreams, and City in Ruins, is extremely economical in its word count.
Yeah.
There is not a single word out of place, and there is not a single word that you could take out. And that means that because it's being so economical, it's also very dialogue heavy. And he essentially is cutting out all the extra fluff around the dialogue. We don't need to be told all the time who is saying what. We don't need to be told what they're doing or what their expression is or what they're feeling, because it's obvious in what they're saying. And he plays with the rhythm of how you're reading by shortening sentences and by directing you to how people are talking to each other.
Yeah.
So what this book is about is a very loose modern retelling of the Trojan War based on the mob. It's set in Providence, Rhode Island, and the two sides of this war are the Italian mob and the Irish mob. And another reason why this falls into the great dialogue category is that Don Winslow is very intentional in how people speak. And you can tell in how certain things are spelled, in some slang that's a little bit more of an obvious one, but also in how characters engage with each other and how that comes out and how they're talking to each other. And it's different when we're with the Irish and when we're with the Italians.
How they react to things.
How they react to things. And a lot of it comes out in how they speak. And it's a huge part of building, world building, if you will, for these two factions and these two groups of people as they're at war with each other. Don Winslow is one of my favorite writers for a reason. I think the type of personality that he puts into his prose is very, very present in his dialogue, and he's very intentional in how he uses words. and who is using those words. And this last trilogy of his, he's now retired from writing, is just a recap of his greatest hits, and a writer who is extremely experienced. And like I said, there's not a superfluous word in this book.
The next one I'll recommend is extremely similar in why it's on the list to Tana French, so I'll just get it out of the way. I don't have to say too much about it. It's The Commitments by Roddy Doyle, another of my favourite Irish authors. Another author that honestly encapsulates my Dublin to me more than any other Irish writer, really. Just in terms of character voice and in terms of how normal everyday people talk to each other. Roddy Doyle can still be fairly artistic and sort of poignant in his narration and his sort of storytelling. Maybe with other books, The Commitments is pure dialogue. It's all dialogue. And the characters become distinct in how they speak. This is set in the 80s in Dublin, when Dublin was still really not doing well economically, when Ireland wasn't doing well economically, when nobody could get a job. And this is about a group of teenagers who decide to set up a soul rock band called The Commitments. And they're really, it's kind of at the time when sort of counterculture, alternative, cool rock and sort of synth music was becoming very, very popular. They kind of create a band that is harkening back to like the 50s and 60s style of music, and also a very African American inspired style of music. There's not a ton of narration. It's kind of all fed through characters just speaking to each other. There's not much of a story. It's just sort of their regular lives. They sort of get on with things. They do things. The book doesn't necessarily have an ending. It doesn't have a beginning and an end. It just sort of, it's a snapshot in time of their lives. And it's a snapshot of a time period in Dublin. But also just a culture that still exists, and a way that people deal with not having anything, not having any options, which is unfortunately coming back around again with how expensive everything is. A little bit of forewarning as well. I do need to warn you, there is a lot of language in here that may seem to readers not from Dublin that every character in this is hyper offensive and perhaps holds bigoted views. That is really not the case. Some of these characters in this book, I feel like Dublin people in general, very open and accepting of other people, but perhaps the language may not indicate that. But there's a disconnect there where it's not used maliciously. There's a lot of foul language in here, and I'm talking about like slurs and that kind of thing that just sort of thrown out there, but more so because the characters just don't have a filter. It's something that has been a conversation more so in the 21st century in Ireland about how we all speak and sort of the looseness of language, and it's still something that is present. We're a very loose-lipped, loose-tongued country, but it's not, the vast majority of people, it's not malicious. None of the words are used with their actual intended meaning at heart. The vast majority, there's bigots everywhere. There's people that use this language as it's intended, but just this language gets thrown out and about. So just a forewarning as well. If you pick this up and you're like, this character just said this word, culturally speaking and sort of contextually, things were the way they were back in the 80s. But yeah, it's not intended in that sort of offensive way. It's just language being used openly and kind of without filter. It's just sort of an authentic, honest portrayal of Dublin, and working class Dublin specifically. Roddy Doyle writes about working class Dublin, and in my opinion captures it better than James Joyce, for example.
The next one that I want to mention is Happy Place by Emily Henry. And honestly, I think any Emily Henry book can be here. And this is contemporary romance. Arguably, Emily Henry is the contemporary romance writer right now. And I think romance is one of those genres where dialogue is particularly important. I think it's important everywhere, but there are different types of stories where you might have an exceptional plot, and if the dialogue is like just fine, you can get away with it and have a good time. For me personally, I think romance needs to have great dialogue, because if the dialogue between the two romantic leads is not believable or doesn't have that spark, I'm not going to believe that they're falling in love. That chemistry can only be created if the dialogue is great. And what I mean by dialogue being great in this context is it has to reflect the personality of each character. Each character has to have a defined personality. And that has to come out in the way they speak and in the way they speak to each other. And what they're saying to each other might not be as important as how they're saying it. That needs to make me understand why they like each other. And Emily Henry is very, very good at this. Every time I've read all of her books, and every time she gets me invested in the central romance extremely quickly, because she's very good at banter between characters and at establishing through that dialogue who they are, where they're at in life, what they want, and what they think of the other person, which is not always how they feel at the end of the book. But she's not just good at dialogue between the romantic leads, even though that obviously takes the forefront in a contemporary romance novel. She's also good at dialogue between friends. And that's why I think Happy Place is a good example for this list in particular, because it probably has my favorite like friend group in her novels. Some of the other ones have a slightly weaker supporting cast or just a smaller supporting cast. And in this case, we're dealing with a group of 6 friends, essentially 3 couples, and everybody has their history with each other, and it deals a lot with getting a bit older and not seeing your friends all the time anymore, so you don't know everything that's going on in their life and how different characters are wrestling with that. So everybody has their history with each other. Everybody has different amounts of information about everybody else, and that comes out in how they're talking to each other. And she's very good at finding that line between extreme closeness and familiarity, but also there now being some gaps and some secrets and just some information that isn't being shared because people are evolving in different ways and not seeing each other every day anymore. So this is a great book, not just a great contemporary romance, but just a great book, to be honest. It's a great romance, and it has great dialogue.
So we mentioned getting story across in dialogue and it feeling either authentic or inauthentic or organic or inorganic. And one of the best recent examples that I've read of conveying story and theme and character all mainly through dialogue is Percival Everett's Wounded, which I think now that I'm a month or 2 removed from my little spree of reading Percival Everett, this is my favourite. And this is a neo-Western crime novel, literary crime, whatever. Put it in whatever box you want. The star of this novel is the dialogue and how it handles its themes through the conversations that the characters have with each other and their viewpoints and how they express themselves. And it is thoroughly engaging and gripping and absorbing. You get invested in what they're saying. You get invested in the circumstances of the characters. It concerns a black horse trainer in Wyoming who lives in a small town, runs a farm, which is kind of an unusual thing in sort of white cowboy country. And in the town, there is a murder, a hate crime, where a gay man is found dead, badly beaten. And the town has to kind of wrestle with feelings of intolerance and maybe sort of casual feelings of intolerance and subtle feelings of intolerance. And everybody, including the main character, has to question their own prejudice and do I have prejudice? And all of these kinds of complex feelings that come up because of this horrible event that happens. And the aftermath of it is very interesting to read and very page-turny as well. But it's also a book just about damaged people, wounded people. And there's a lot of sort of metaphor and symbolism with nature and kind of the physical things that the characters are doing in scenes while they're talking. There's just a lot of kind of mirroring. But the dialogue is absolutely king here. And the story is conveyed very naturally and unfolds very naturally through that dialogue. And I think if you want to give Percival Everett a go, this is an interesting place to start, because it also thematically deals with everything he likes to deal with. Race relations in the US, ideas of tolerance, intolerance. What does that look like when it's harsher, when it's more evident, when it's more explicit versus when it's more subtle? And what do those sort of conversations look like? All of that is in here, but it's also a really gripping crime story, and it's an unusual point of view and perspective as well. One thing about Percival Everett is quite often his protagonists can feel a bit samey. They're all sort of well-spoken, reserved, and the voice can be a little repetitive. If you read several of his books in a row.
6 in 2 months?
Yeah, like what I did. But I just find myself drawn to all of his protagonists. He does, in a sense, distinguish all of them, even though, I guess, voice-wise, they can all feel somewhat similar. But the dialogue in Wounded is absolutely stellar. Highly recommend. Percy for the win.
The next one I'm going to mention is a bit of a and not a book I need to pitch to anybody new who hasn't heard about it before, because it is A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin and A Song of Ice and Fire as a whole. Yeah. But I did want to bring it up because it has great dialogue, and with it comes great character voice. What I was most impressed by when I first read this series, and that has remained the case, is how he manages to make it immediately evident whose head you're in by how he's writing, even though it's not even first person, it's third person, but he puts the character's personality in the writing, and that's in the narration and his prose, but it is also obviously in his dialogue. And he brings a lot of the story out in the dialogue, and he manages to, in my opinion, always have you know what's going on, but the dialogue is never filled with exposition. It's never unnatural. It always feels very, very seamless. And a lot of great scenes in this series are just two people sitting in a room talking to each other. I think particularly the early seasons of the show took a lot of verbatim conversations, word for word, from the book and adapted them or expanded on them, and then created similar scenes with just people in rooms in that same kind of tone. And I think it's what initially made that show. They lost sight of that a little bit. But that's all coming from George. So if you are one of those people that has just seen the show and not read the books, perhaps because they're not finished and the end of the show was terrible and all those things, which is fair, but maybe if that can encourage you, he is truly a master of his craft, and I think the books are well worth still reading, even if we never get Winds of Winter or A Dream of Spring. There's not much more that I can say about A Song of Ice and Fire that a million other people haven't already told you, but specifically looking at the dialogue, I think it's one of the best in fantasy as a genre.
Yeah.
So yeah, Gurm.
I want to take you back to a couple hundred years ago now. And,
yes.
Talk about one of my favorite classics, maybe my favorite. That is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. A lot of the dialogue in this book I could probably quote day to day.
You can and you do.
Yeah. And the thing I love most about Pride and Prejudice and sort of Jane Austen and her sensibilities, her sense and sensibilities, is her poking fun at the ridiculousness of sort of everyday society and the things that we do in this charade we call life. And she specifically sort of takes the piss, takes the mick, as it were, of sort of highfalutin society. And she does it in a very clever, biting way through the characters. Quite often, there are characters that are quite self-aware, and there are characters that are very not self-aware, and the way they speak and communicate is basically Jane Austen holding up a mirror to them, but as you, the reader, you get to sort of see where she's poking fun, and there's a real talent in that. Pride and Prejudice is my favourite Jane Austen story because it has my favourite Jane Austen characters, and each one has a very distinct voice and kind of mannerisms as well, and sort of the way they speak. Darcy is very curt, man of few words. And then you've got Mr. Collins, who is overly loquacious.
Man of many, many, many words.
Yeah, and the way she does that is really funny, honestly, really entertaining. If you're in any way afraid of reading classics and like feeling like, oh, bogged down, too many words or whatever, or like, oh, it'll feel like homework, just try a book like this. It's exceptionally entertaining. And there's nothing else to say about it. It's Jane Austen, you know?
I'm just going to add a little plug for my favourite Jane Austen, which I also think has exceptional dialogue, and that is Northanger Abbey. I think...
I haven't read that yet.
Yeah, it's more dialogue heavy than, say, Persuasion, for example. And I think it is more like banter focused than like, say, Mansfield Park, so it is very funny, and the dialogue and the social commentary are just top notch.
I think that's why I didn't vibe as much with Persuasion.
Probably.
Because I like Jane Austen when she's doing that.
Yeah. The last book I have is another one that we have talked about on the channel before, so you might recognize it, and that is Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. Now, there's a lot of things that this book is great at, but dialogue is certainly one of them. So if you don't know anything about this book, I won't tell you too much because, again, this is one that I think is better going in kind of blind.
Yeah.
But we do follow a main character. Her name is Irina, and she is a fetish photographer. That is kind of all you need to know about her. It's a first-person narration. We're very much in her head, and what a place to be. This is a dark exploration of feminism in a weird, twisted, upside-down kind of way. It's also a bit of a female American Psycho interpretation. That's all you really need to know about the book. It is propulsive and extremely readable. This is due to a couple of things. I think partially it's because you have no idea where it's going, and it creates this morbid fascination and curiosity with where we're going to end up. But another huge element, I think, is the way Eliza Clark writes. Irina's internal voice, and also her dialogue with all the people she interacts with.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's genuinely just awful, and sometimes there's an element of, I wish I could speak to people like that. Sometimes. Don't get me wrong. But there's an element of satisfaction sometimes because she doesn't have much of a filter. She's pretty horrible. And again, that creates this morbid fascination. There's also a very specific sense of place. It's set in Newcastle in England, and she uses the slang and she uses the type of language that people will use there very, very effectively. So it has a very strong sense of personality, and you learn slowly about Irina and how she interacts with other people. Not because anything that she says is necessarily true, but just in how she approaches those interactions and how she feels about how she approaches those interactions later and while they're occurring. It's a really, really great book. And unlike anything I've ever read, it's hilarious and also exceptionally dark. And if any of that makes you curious, I think you should just pick it up, not look up anything about it, and give it a go.
When we decided to do a video recommending books about dialogue, obviously my brain went into overdrive because there are a lot of books clearly that I love because of dialogue, or love books that have great dialogue, and it's just the thing that I personally notice. So I have a couple of more books to mention, just because I kept adding books to my little pile. There are many books that I could also mention that I'll just leave off, but I kind of wanted to get a breadth of genre and have sort of a representation for whatever genres. I talked a lot in the beginning about books about Dublin and like that kind of side of my upbringing. There's one I want to mention just very briefly for my Spanish side, which is an author, Domingo Villar. Only one of his books are translated, and I'm not sure how they would translate into English, but one is Death on a Galician Shore, and his dialogue is also very evocative of Galicia, which is my region of Spain, and how people talk to each other, how people answer questions with another question, and you'll never get a straight answer out of anyone from Galicia. And there's that side of my heritage as well that is very well represented in that writer. But I've already got books about crime and where I grew up and all that kind of stuff. So I've got two more books here, one historical fiction, one fantasy, and I'll mention these for their great dialogue. And the first one is the Cicero trilogy by Robert Harris. I'll just, specifically, the first book is called Imperium, if you just want to try the first book. Cicero is a diva. And his wife Terentia is also a diva, but she is a queen. The dialogue in this little series, I have it in one sort of omnibus edition, a bind up, whatever you call it. All three books in one. This is obviously set in ancient Rome, right about the time of the early days of Caesar and kind of the fall of the Roman Republic. It's a political thriller, a legal thriller. A lot of courtroom drama as well. And there are a lot of speeches and writings of Cicero taken kind of verbatim and put into this book. And Robert Harris really did his research. A lot of this is quite historically accurate as far as I know. And just the voice that he gives to the characters really endears you to them. And also the voice he gives to all of the antagonists really makes you hate them. So there's a vividness to it all and a kind of a rousing love for the time period and for what some of these characters stood for, because even though all of this is 2,000 years ago, we're going through the same problems now. It's in a way depressing, but also he wants to show you that people like this will always exist, to fight the good fight, to fight for democracy and the rule of law and people being nice to each other and fighting against corruption and that kind of thing. But the dialogue in the Cicero books is fire. So that's one for the historical fiction readers. And lastly, for you fantasy fans, we've already talked about Game of Thrones, but I just want to mention it very quickly. That's The Black Tongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. I think the dialogue in this is exceptional. This is a fantasy book all about tavern hopping, and there's a little quest that, honestly, I could take it or leave it. I don't really care. This book, to me, is all about the humor, the dialogue, how the characters interact with each other, and all the tavern hopping. This feels like the most Irish fantasy book that I've read. All of the banter and the back and forth between the main characters in this book is absolutely hilarious, thoroughly entertaining to read. Everybody's very distinct. They're a little caricature-ish, but it's just heightened in that way that is thoroughly entertaining. So The Black Tongue Thief is one that I kind of want to give a little special shout out to for the fantasy side of things. I know people say that Joe Abercrombie has great dialogue in the fantasy sphere. I haven't read Abercrombie yet. Many people tell me that he will be my cup of tea, and I'm pretty sure he will be. But in terms of that realm, I guess The Black Tongue Thief, from all accounts, is sort of in that vein of distinct character voices and dialogue. So, Black Tongue Thief, Christopher Buehlman, one of my favourite fantasy books. And I believe that is everything.
That is everything. Yeah.
We talked about a lot of books.
As always, let us know what you think of these recommendations and if you're interested in picking any of them up if you haven't already. But also let us know if there are any books that you notice the dialogue being particularly good in. Send those recommendations our way, and also let us know if there's any other theme that you look for in books that you would like a video on.
What's the last thing you asked a bookseller in a bookshop for? Put it in the comments down below.
Or what's the last thing you wanted to ask for and didn't?
Yeah. Like the video if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't already. And we will see you for another one of these videos soon, I'm sure.
Thank you for watching.